There's a particular kind of loneliness that catches you off guard in your later years. It's not the loneliness of being alone, actually. It's something far more confusing. It's the loneliness you feel sitting right there at the family dinner table, surrounded by people who love you, yet somehow feeling more misunderstood than ever before. You start wondering, when did the people who know me best stop really seeing me? When did I become someone they manage instead of someone they simply enjoy? I want to share something with you today that took me decades to understand, and honestly, I wish someone had pulled me aside years ago to explain it. After 65, the relationships that once felt automatic, that once just worked without much thought, they require something different from us now. Not more effort necessarily, but a different kind of wisdom. And here's the part that might surprise you. Sometimes the key to staying close to the people you love is knowing exactly what not to give them. Not your money, not your opinions, not even all of your truth. What I'm talking about is understanding the art of strategic withholding for the sake of genuine connection. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to explore 5 specific things that, paradoxically, you should keep more to yourself if you want your family relationships to thrive in this chapter of life. This isn't about building walls or becoming distant. It's about something far more sophisticated. It's about recognizing that the family dynamics you're navigating now are fundamentally different from the ones you knew at 40 or 50, and they require a completely different playbook. Before we dive into the specifics, let's talk about why this even matters. Why does the equation change so dramatically after 65? Well, think about the shift that's happened in your family structure. Your children aren't children anymore. They're fully formed adults with their own anxieties, their own financial pressures, their own complex lives that you only see fragments of. They're juggling careers that demand everything from them, raising children in a world that feels more uncertain than the one you navigated, managing marriages and mortgages, and a constant flood of information that tells them they're never doing enough. And here's what happens in their minds, often completely unconsciously. When they look at you, they're not just seeing their parent anymore. They're seeing their future. They're seeing their own mortality reflected back at them. They're seeing responsibility looming on the horizon, a responsibility they're not sure they're ready for. Every phone call from you triggers a tiny alarm in their nervous system. Is everything okay? Is this the call where everything changes? This isn't their fault. It's just the reality of where everyone is developmentally. Meanwhile, you're in a completely different headspace. You're not sitting around thinking about decline and dependency. You're thinking about the garden you want to plant this spring, the book club meeting next Thursday, the trip you're planning to see an old friend you haven't visited in years. You're thinking about freedom, finally, after decades of other people's schedules running your life. You're thinking about choice and autonomy and making the most of the time you have left where you're still healthy and capable. But here's where the wires get crossed. Your adult children are often operating from a place of anticipatory anxiety, while you're operating from a place of present-moment living. And when those two realities collide, especially when you share certain types of information, it creates friction that nobody intended. It creates a dynamic where suddenly you're being treated like you need more help than you do, where your decisions are questioned, where your independence slowly starts to erode, not because anyone is malicious, but because everyone is operating from different emotional scripts. Understanding this fundamental mismatch is crucial because it helps you see why withholding certain information isn't about dishonesty. It's about managing the emotional ecosystem of your family relationships with skill and intention. Let's start with the most obvious one, but the one that's also the most misunderstood: your complete financial picture. Now, I can already hear some of you thinking, but shouldn't my family know what I have? Shouldn't they be prepared? And yes, there's a version of preparation that's absolutely necessary, but there's a canyon-sized difference between having proper legal documents in place and giving your family a detailed running commentary on your bank balances and investment decisions. Here's what I've observed happen over and over again. The moment you disclose your full financial situation, something shifts in how people relate to you. It's subtle at first. Maybe it's a comment about a purchase you made. Maybe it's a suggestion about downsizing that comes a little too quickly, a little too insistently. Maybe it's the way conversations start to orient around your resources rather than around you as a person. I know a woman named Dorothy who decided to be completely transparent with her two daughters about her finances. She showed them everything: the savings accounts, the modest investment portfolio, the insurance policies, the whole picture. She thought it would give everyone peace of mind. But within 6 months, she noticed something had changed. Her daughters started having conversations about her that didn't include her. Should Mom really be spending money on that? Shouldn't we encourage her to be more conservative? They meant well, absolutely, but Dorothy found herself in this strange position where she felt accountable to her own children for how she spent money she had earned and saved. Here's the deeper issue. When your family knows your exact financial situation, they start doing something called mental accounting on your behalf. They start thinking about that money in relation to their own lives, their own needs, their own futures. Again, this isn't necessarily greedy or malicious, it's just human psychology. That money stops being simply yours. It becomes part of a larger family narrative that includes college funds for grandchildren, safety nets for emergencies, inheritances that might help with mortgages or retirements. And once that mental accounting begins, your spending decisions become subject to invisible scrutiny. You book a cruise, and instead of celebrating with you, someone's calculating whether that's really the best use of resources. You donate to a cause that matters to you, and someone's wondering if that's wise, given that you might need care later. You buy yourself something nice, something that brings you joy, and suddenly there's this undercurrent of judgment, spoken or unspoken. But here's what really gets lost in these dynamics. This is your money. These are the resources you accumulated through decades of work, of sacrifice, of decisions nobody else had to make. You already gave so much to raise your family, to provide for them, to set them up for their own lives. The resources you have now, they're not a family commons that requires consensus. They're yours to steward as you see fit. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have your affairs in order. You absolutely should have a clear will. You should have designated someone trustworthy to handle things if you become incapacitated. You should have had honest conversations with a good estate attorney. All of that is responsible and necessary, but that's different from giving your family real-time updates on your financial status. That's different from justifying your choices or submitting your budget for review. What you need is strategic transparency. Share the framework, not the details. Let them know you have things properly documented and legally arranged. Let them know who to contact if something happens to you. But the day-to-day management of your resources, the decision about whether to splurge on something or save it, the choice to be generous with a cause or a person you care about, those decisions are yours alone, and you don't owe anyone an explanation. Protecting this boundary isn't about secrecy, it's about protecting your autonomy. It's about ensuring that in these years, when you finally have the freedom to make choices purely based on what brings you joy or meaning, you actually get to exercise that freedom without an invisible committee weighing in. Now let's talk about something that feels so innocent, so natural, that most of us don't even realize we're doing it until the consequences are already in motion. I'm talking about sharing every little health complaint, every minor ache and pain, every moment of physical discomfort that's really just part of the aging process. Here's what happens. You mentioned casually that you've been having some hip pain after gardening. Just a comment, right? Just sharing your day. But what your daughter hears is something entirely different. She hears a warning signal. She hears the beginning of a decline. She starts imagining falls, broken bones, her mother unable to live independently. And suddenly, the next time you talk, she's asking if you've seen a doctor. She's researching physical therapists in your area. She's wondering aloud if maybe you should think about moving to a place with less yard work. Let me tell you about Harold. He's 78, sharp as a tack, still drives himself everywhere, manages his household without any help. But he made the mistake of mentioning to his son that he'd felt a little dizzy one morning after getting up too quickly. That's all it was, just stood up too fast, that thing that can happen at any age. But his son latched onto it. Within a week, Harold had been scheduled for a complete cardiac workup. His son started calling every morning to check if he'd taken his blood pressure. And the real kicker? His son started suggesting, very gently, that maybe Harold shouldn't be driving anymore, just to be safe, just until we figure out what's going on. Harold told me it took him months to walk that back, to convince his son that he was fine, that it was nothing. And even now, there's this new cautiousness in how his son treats him, this new tendency to ask if he's sure he should do something. The dynamic shifted, and Harold realized too late that his one casual comment had changed how his son saw him. This is the thing about health information. It's incredibly potent. Your family loves you, and because they love you, they're primed to worry. Every little symptom you mention becomes data in a larger pattern they're tracking, often without even realizing it. They're collecting these pieces of information and assembling them into a narrative about your decline, even when you yourself don't feel like you're declining at all. Now, I want to be very clear here. I am not suggesting you hide serious health issues. If you're diagnosed with something significant, if you're dealing with a condition that actually impacts your daily functioning or your safety, absolutely your family should know. They should be part of that conversation. They should be able to support you meaningfully. But there's a massive difference between sharing serious health information and providing a running commentary on every stiff joint and every sleepless night. Think about it this way. At this stage of life, your body is simply older. Things hurt sometimes that didn't used to hurt. You don't bounce back from physical activity the way you did at 40. Your sleep pattern is different. Your energy fluctuates. All of that is completely normal. It doesn't mean you're becoming incapable. It just means you're aging, which is literally what every human body does if it's lucky enough to keep going. But when you narrate every single aspect of that aging process to your family, you're essentially inviting them to monitor you, to assess you, to make judgments about what you should and shouldn't be doing based on incomplete information filtered through their own anxiety. You're accidentally turning yourself into a patient in their eyes rather than a parent who's simply living your life. The alternative is to become more discerning about what you share. You can still be honest, you can still have real conversations, but you can filter them through a simple question. Is this something that requires their input or support? Or is this just normal life in an aging body? If it's the latter, you might be better served by mentioning it to your doctor, dealing with it yourself, or simply accepting it as part of the territory without making it a topic of family discussion. Here's what I've found works beautifully. When someone asks how you're feeling, you can be truthful and still boundaried. You can say something like, "I'm doing well, some good days and some slower days, but that's life, isn't it?" That's honest without being an inventory. That's real without being alarming. It acknowledges your humanity without turning your body into a source of constant concern for everyone around you. Here's one that's incredibly hard to hold back, especially when you care deeply and you've lived long enough to see patterns that your children can't see yet. I'm talking about your opinions on how they're raising their kids, how they're managing their marriages, how they're running their households, how they're making their career decisions. You watch your daughter exhaust herself trying to be the perfect parent, and you want to tell her she's being too hard on herself. You see your son letting his kids have unlimited screen time, and you remember how important it was to play outside. You notice your daughter-in-law scheduling activities for the grandkids every single day, and you think those children need unstructured time. You see choices that worry you, patterns that concern you, and because you love these people, your instinct is to speak up. But here's what I've learned, often through painful experience. Your opinion, even when it's gentle, even when it's offered with love, even when you're absolutely right, it lands differently than you intend. Because here's what's happening on the other side. Your adult children are already drowning in self-doubt. They're already wondering if they're doing it right. They're already comparing themselves to other parents, already feeling judged by society, already anxious about whether they're screwing up their kids. And when you offer an opinion, even a mild one, what they often hear is confirmation of their worst fear. I'm not doing this right. I'll tell you about Margaret. She watched her grandson, who was about 7 at the time, have a complete meltdown in a restaurant because he didn't get the exact meal he wanted. Margaret's daughter handled it by immediately offering alternatives, negotiating, trying to calm him down with promises. And Margaret, who had raised 4 kids with a much firmer approach, very gently suggested later that maybe giving in to tantrums wasn't the best long-term strategy. She said it kindly. She didn't lecture, she just offered it as a thought. But her daughter shut down. She went quiet, ended the visit earlier than planned, and for the next several months, Margaret noticed she wasn't invited to family dinners as often. When they did get together, there was this new tension, this carefulness. Her daughter was defensive in ways she hadn't been before, and Margaret realized that her one comment, her one small piece of advice, had created a rift that took over a year to fully heal. Here's the thing. Your children aren't raising kids in the same world you did. They're dealing with different pressures, different cultural expectations, different information. They have access to parenting resources you never had, but they also have access to judgment and comparison at a level that didn't exist before. They're exhausted in ways that are hard to explain, juggling demands that are relentless. And when you offer your opinion, what you're often doing, unintentionally, is adding one more voice to the chorus of criticism they're already hearing in their own heads. You're not helping, you're piling on. Even when you're right, even when you have valuable wisdom to share, the timing and the power dynamic make it almost impossible for them to receive it well. So what do you do instead? How do you care without interfering? Here's what I've found works. You bear witness without judgment. You stay present without inserting yourself. You offer support without strings attached. When your daughter is overwhelmed, you don't tell her what she's doing wrong. You say, what would be most helpful to you right now? Should I take the kids for an afternoon so you can rest? When you see parenting choices you disagree with, you remind yourself that these are not your children to raise. You already had your turn. These are their children, and they get to figure it out. Make mistakes, learn their own lessons. Your job now is not to correct or improve or fix. Your job is to be a source of unconditional support, someone they can come to without fear of judgment. And here's the beautiful thing that happens when you hold back your opinions. Your relationship deepens. Because instead of feeling evaluated every time they see you, they feel accepted. Instead of bracing for criticism, they can actually relax in your presence. And when they do want advice, when they genuinely ask for your perspective, they'll come to you. And in that moment, because you haven't been peppering them with unsolicited opinions all along, your words will actually carry weight. They'll actually be received. The hardest part of aging wisely is learning that love sometimes looks like silence. It looks like biting your tongue, even when you have something you're dying to say. It looks like trusting the people you raised to find their own way, even when you can see pitfalls they can't. That's not indifference. That's profound respect, and it's one of the greatest gifts you can give to your adult children. Now we come to something that's much more subtle, much more internal, but equally important. I'm talking about your deeper regrets, those moments when you look back over your life and wish certain things had gone differently. Maybe you wish you'd traveled more before responsibilities made it harder. Maybe you wish you'd taken a different career path. Maybe you wish you'd been braver about pursuing a dream that got set aside. These reflections are a natural part of looking back over a long life. But here's what I've come to understand. Not every regret needs to be spoken aloud to your family. Let me explain why this matters. When you express regret about choices you made, especially choices that involved your family, your children often internalize that in ways you never intended. You might say something like, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd finished my degree instead of staying home with you kids. In your mind, you're just reflecting, just acknowledging a road not taken. But what your daughter hears is, raising you was a sacrifice I'm not sure was worth it. What your son hears is, I gave up my dreams for you and I resent it. They hear rejection where you meant reflection. They feel guilt where you were just being honest about the complexity of life choices. And once those words are out there, you can't take them back. They sit in the space between you, creating distance you never intended. I knew a man named Robert who told his son during what he thought was just an honest conversation that he sometimes regretted not taking a job opportunity in another city when he was younger. It would have meant better career advancement, more money, a different life trajectory. He was just musing, just acknowledging that life is full of trade-offs. But his son internalized it completely differently. He started to see his childhood, which he'd always thought of as stable and happy, through this new lens of his father's disappointment. It changed something fundamental in how he understood his own story. Here's the deeper truth. Your regrets, especially the ones tied to family sacrifices, are sacred territory. They're part of your inner life, your private reckoning with how things unfolded. They deserve to be processed, absolutely. They deserve to be examined and understood, but they don't necessarily deserve to be shared with the very people who might take them personally. This doesn't mean you pretend your life was perfect. It doesn't mean you put on a fake smile and claim you have no complicated feelings about your choices. But it does mean you're thoughtful about who you process those feelings with and how. Maybe you work through them with a therapist or a counselor. Maybe you write about them in a journal. Maybe you talk about them with a friend who's in a similar life stage and can understand without taking it personally. What you avoid is dumping those regrets onto your children or grandchildren in a way that makes them feel like collateral damage of your disappointments. Because here's what happens when you do that. They start to reinterpret their entire relationship with you. Moments they thought were about love and connection, they now wonder if those were actually moments of resentment. Times you thought you were happy, they now question whether you were just making the best of a situation you didn't want. The alternative is to frame your life story in a way that acknowledges complexity without assigning blame. Instead of saying, I wish I'd done things differently, you can say, I've learned so much from the path I took. Instead of expressing regret about sacrifices, you can acknowledge the richness that came from the choices you made, even if they foreclosed other possibilities. That's not dishonesty. That's wisdom. It's understanding that how you narrate your life shapes not just your own peace, but the peace of the people who shared that life with you. Finally, let's talk about estate planning, specifically about the details of who's getting what after you're gone. This one trips up so many well-meaning people because we're told over and over that we should be transparent, that we should avoid surprises, that clarity prevents conflict, and to some extent that's true. But there's a version of transparency that actually creates more problems than it solves. Here's what I mean. When you sit your children down and tell them exactly how you're dividing your assets, exactly who's getting the house, exactly how the accounts are split, you think you're preventing future arguments. But what you're often actually doing is inviting present-day resentment, comparison, and entitlement. Because once people know what they're getting, they start to have opinions about whether it's fair, whether it's enough, whether it should be handled differently. I'll give you an example. Thomas decided to tell his 3 children exactly how he was splitting his estate. He thought he was being fair, equal shares, everything clear. But his middle child, who had stayed local and helped him more over the years, felt that equal wasn't the same as fair. His youngest child, who was struggling financially, started making comments about how the money would really help right now, hinting that maybe some of it could come early. And his oldest child started offering unsolicited advice about whether Thomas should sell the house now or wait, based entirely on maximizing what would eventually come to them. What had been simple family relationships became transactional. Thomas found himself justifying his own spending decisions, feeling guilty when he wanted to take a trip or make a purchase, because now his kids were mentally calculating how it affected their inheritance. He told me he wished he'd kept the whole thing private until after he was gone. Here's the reality. Your estate plan should absolutely exist. It should be clear, legal, properly documented. You should have a will. You should have designated executors. You should have made decisions about who gets what. But those decisions are between you and your attorney. They're not a family discussion topic. They're not something that needs to be previewed or debated or explained while you're still here living your life. Because here's what you deserve in these final decades of your life. You deserve to make decisions about your own resources without anyone else's input. You deserve to spend your money on what brings you joy without someone calculating how it affects their future. You deserve to be seen as a person, not as an estate to be managed. And the only way to protect that is to keep the specific details of your planning private until they need to be known.
So here we are, 5 things to guard more carefully in this stage of life. Not because you're being secretive, not because you don't trust your family, but because you understand something that only comes with age and experience. Peace is precious. Autonomy is sacred. And sometimes the way you protect both is by knowing what to hold close. You've spent decades giving your time, your energy, your resources, your wisdom. You've earned the right now to receive something back, not just from others, but from yourself. You've earned the right to privacy, to boundaries, to making choices without a committee. You've earned the right to be seen as a whole person, not as someone who needs to be managed or monitored or fixed. So I'll leave you with this question. What will you choose to guard more carefully from now on? Not as a secret, but as something sacred, something that belongs to you alone. Think about it, honor it, and know that in doing so, you're not pulling away from the people you love. You're actually creating the space for those relationships to be healthier, freer, more genuine. That's not selfishness. That's wisdom, and it's exactly what this stage of life calls for.